Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to have yet another look at some video game history, and in the process answer the question, what exactly made Rome Total War great? First released all the way back in 2004 as the third release of the Total War franchise, and spawning multiple expansion packs as well as a sequel and a remaster, Rome Total War is without any exaggeration one of the most beloved titles in the entire franchise, and also one of the most important strategy games ever created, to the tune that it has even had an impact outside of video games and into other media such as, for example, television. But to understand why this is the case, let's talk about what exactly made the game great. And the first thing I do need to bring up is the previous Total War games and the lessons learned from those games. It's worth noting that the ideas behind the Total War franchise were still relatively new. Creative Assembly, prior to Shogun Total War, was mainly known for sports games, with the occasional rail shooter or side-scroller from the 80s to boot. And while other developers had tried to make somewhat similar games, such as, for example, the Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds video game from 1998, or more specifically, the PC version, those games still were relatively niche. Or in the case of, for example, the original Cossacks, still lacked certain elements that made Total War what it was, namely the grand strategy elements. By contrast, Shogun Total War was a legitimately mainstream title, with a relatively open-ended campaign, utilizing a Risk-style grand strategy element to hold the real-time battles together like glue. This system was improved upon with Medieval as well, adding more to the strategic depth as well as, of course, siege battles. The point is, by the time of Rome Total War, while it is true that Creative Assembly only had 2 previous strategy games under their belt and only 3 years worth of experience on the subject, those games and years played a crucial role in helping to make Rome Total War what it was. They showed both what worked as well as what could be improved. And on that subject, let's move on to the next thing that made Rome Total War great: the improvements to the campaign system. It's quite apparent that Creative Assembly realized that the Risk-style map had some notable shortcomings, and was limited in what it could accomplish. It is for this reason that Rome Total War was the first title to include the campaign-style map that Total War fans of today are familiar with. This allowed for many new features that had a very real impact on gameplay, as roads, for example, could and would absolutely increase your army's movement speed on the campaign map. Additionally, this allowed for a proper fog of war system, requiring players to first find enemy armies and settlements in order to be able to attack them in the first place. The system also allowed for maps to be area specific and be determined by where exactly within a province your army is located. As for example, if the player decided to place their army next to a bridge and fight a battle there, then the bridge would be a key feature on the battle map and enable you to adjust your tactics accordingly. Needless to say, this sort of change to the campaign map itself was nothing short of revolutionary, and was very much leaps and bounds ahead of what previous Total War games had done with the system. And also, of course, it helped further tie the grand strategy elements to the actual real-time battles themselves. Speaking of which, now's the perfect time to move on to another thing that helped make Rome Total War great: the fact that it was the first Total War game to utilize 3D models in its real-time battles. As one may expect, the change from using 2D sprites in previous Total War titles to instead 3D models to depict their real-time battles was a massive improvement from a technical standpoint, and helped make the game graphically impressive due to the sheer scale of the number of units on screen. Now granted, Rome Total War was not technically the first game to do this sort of thing, as one could look at the previously aforementioned Cossacks as a good example. However, while Cossacks did marry large-scale battles with 3D models for the units, it still utilized an isometric style map system, unlike Total War, which instead opted for a 3D map style system from the very beginning. It wasn't all just graphics, though, that were an improvement here, as these 3D models had mass to them as well, meaning that they had a very real impact on the gameplay, allowing cavalry to legitimately crash into enemy lines, causing gaps to form, and infantry to fly through the air, meaning that Rome Total War is another one of those cases where it can be said that the graphics had a meaningful impact on the gameplay, and weren't just eye candy for the sake of eye candy. Moving on, let's talk about another thing that made the game great: the speeches made by the general before each battle. These may seem like a relatively small feature, but they helped create an actual narrative at work, as they tended to not only reference details within the battle itself, such as the opposing force, the composition of the various armies, as well as their numbers, but it also referenced whether or not there had been previous battles with any specific factions, and even any traits that the general in question may have. In other words, the general speeches were the storytelling element, and in practice they worked perfectly well for what was an open-ended grand strategy title, helping further marry the grand strategy elements to the real-time tactics elements, as well as adding some much needed weight to the real-time tactics elements. So that is another thing that of course helped make Rome Total War great. But another thing I have to bring up is of course the music. It's difficult to underscore just how well of a job the composer Jeff Van Dyke did with the game's soundtrack. It is the quintessential soundtrack to games set in the Age of Antiquity. It is the music that gamers think of when they think of Rome. If I had to describe the soundtrack of Rome Total War in a single word, that word would be divinitas. It's no wonder that this game and its soundtrack were used by documentaries and TV shows centered around ancient warfare, such as, for example, Time Commanders from the BBC or Decisive Battles from the History Channel. With all of this in mind, this has been Ace, and I hope you'll agree when I say that Rome Total War is great.